Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Cory Scheer, a recognized thought leader on trust and how it is built within organizations. He has over 2 decades of experience in leadership roles across multiple sectors, and he's also a best-selling author of the book, Closing the Trust Gap, Taking Action on What Matters Most for Leaders, Teams, and Organizations. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on the widening trust gap within organizations and explore proven ways to bridge that gap. We will also discuss how to gauge the level of trust and/or distrust within your company and talk about why each leader and company should have a trust proposition just as they have a value proposition. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program, Cory.
Thank you so much, Charles. It is great to be with you. I can't wait for this conversation.
Yeah, so Cory, love to have our listeners learn more about your background and your work on trust and what got you interested on this topic.
You bet. So the genesis of my work around trust really formally began in my doctoral program at the University of Missouri. And as I was exploring the various theoretical frameworks and the previous research that had been done, it just evoked this curiosity in me. And that curiosity led to a deep dive on the topic, which I then applied to my leadership roles. And in applying that to my leadership roles, I began to think differently about the concept and the topic of trust, realizing that it's something that is typically not talked about enough within organizations. It's typically not measured formally, and yet it's so critical. It is foundational. It is relational. It's very personal. It is something that is critical for any leader, any team, any organization to have in order for them to experience success. And so as a result of that, I just continued to do this deeper dive work on trust. I did my own national research on it with a fellow friend and somebody who has really encouraged me in my own business. His name is Kurt Bartolich. We did this national research, and when we got the data back, we found what we call an epidemic of distrust that is occurring across multiple industries. And so as a result of that, it felt like something to really focus my time and my energy professionally on, and I'm very glad that I've had the opportunity to do that.
Thank you for providing that insight, because as you mentioned, at the heart of every organization lies this silent crisis, an erosion of trust, and this chasm between the present circumstances and that desirable future. The trust gap is troubling and ever widening.
Yes, it is. And the reason why there's a gap, there's a few different gaps that are occurring. Number one, there is a gap that occurs between the leader's perception of trustworthiness and the frontline employees' level of trustworthiness. So a leader typically thinks that their organization has more trust than it actually has in the minds of the individual contributors or the frontline employees. And then you have this dynamic where you have middle managers or supervisors that are in between both of those individuals or groups. And so now this challenge of middle management or supervisory work becomes even more challenging, because now you have a different version of the truth. There's a version of the truth related to the executive perception, and then there's a version of the truth related to the frontline employee perception. And then the middle managers are having to basically comprehend and then process and translate both of those versions of the truth to each other. And that's a gap that is pervasive among many organizations. The other gap that occurs is when an organization, their reality of their trust gap is revealed to them, and they believe that they need to move the needle, they need to close that gap, they need to become more trustworthy. So for example, if their trust score is at like a 65% and they believe that they need to be at an 80 or an 85%, how is it that they can close that gap? So there are gaps that can occur all over the place within an organization. And unfortunately, if an organization is accepting of that gap, it will have direct and causal effects on many of the key performance indicators that are actually quite troubling, like employee attrition or lower levels of engagement or low levels of creativity, low levels of referral, loyalty. And these are the things that will ultimately affect your bottom line. It will affect your company ethos. It will affect your workplace culture. And so typically when we see gaps occur, the response is usually to the symptoms versus the cause. And trust is something that is causal. It is something that is upstream within a workplace culture. And because of that, it requires a lot of courage to address it and really look at yourself in the mirror as it relates to your company culture.
But we're going to go through some of those ways in which you can address it and close that gap. I'd like to touch upon some of those benefits, which you kind of mentioned those benefits and a negative connotation when trust isn't built. But the powerful benefits of strengthening trust in the workplace, I think they bear repeating. And you list many of them, but some of them are your staff retention will increase, workplace will become less toxic, your employees will work harder, advocacy for your employees to recruit other team members to work for your organization will also increase. Lots of great benefits. Are there one or two that you found through your work that really are at the top of your list?
I think the loyalty is probably the top one for me. And where I think loyalty is very critical is that you may have a team member that has been a part of the organization for a long time. They may be loyal in your eyes, but their loyalty may not be based on a loyalty with a foundation of trust. Their loyalty may be more positional loyalty or obligatory loyalty. And so that differentiation where you have employees, team members that are loyal to the company because of a high level of trust, that's where you're going to see a completely different workplace environment than just employees who are loyal only because it's obligatory loyalty or their loyalty to the position, or they have no other option but to stay with that company. So that to me is a very, very significant difference. And when I work with individuals, leaders, or teams or clients, and they recognize that there's an opportunity to move people from an obligatory loyalty to a trust-based loyalty, and there actually are methods and there's a clear process and a framework to be able to help them do that, that is very, very helpful, and it's hopeful for those leaders and those teams as well.
You have a wonderful study that you conducted that gave you lots of insights on this. And one of the insights that you mentioned in the book is leaders rated their own level of trustworthiness 31% higher than how employees with no leadership responsibilities rated the leader's trustworthiness within that organization, which implies the further the employee is away from being the decision maker or influencer within that organization, the more they're going to possibly distrust the leader in that organization. That's surprising to me.
It was surprising, and that was the average. That was the average gap. So that doesn't include, which we now even see with the survey that we deploy with our clients. Sometimes that perception of gap, the range is even much, much higher than that, but that's just the average. And so, just imagine that your organizational horsepower is operating at a third less power than what it could be operating at. How does that affect your team dynamics? How does that affect your customer relationships? How does that affect your employee engagement? How does that affect just the meetings that you have? Are the meetings focused? Are there interpersonal dynamics that are occurring to where you can have hard, really important, critical conversations and everybody walks away not thinking that there's been a breach of trust, but actually that each other, you're for each other. There's an opportunity to think really dynamically about a situation. And then when you come back together, because you have a strong level of trust, you'll be able to move the organization forward as well. But if you're operating at a third less of that power, it becomes very, very difficult to get the right things done because so much of your energy is used to help mind that gap in trust.
Well, and as you mentioned too, trust will not automatically scale on its own, but trust gaps most certainly will because people leave managers. They don't leave companies. And you have that extension of that kind of that famous quote is people leave managers who create or perpetuate trust gaps.
They will. And if left to its own current situation or current status without any intentional work, that gap will continue to get wider and wider and wider. And that's a tragic reality that leaders have to face. And oftentimes when leaders are new in a position, it's challenging for them to get their arms wrapped around their workplace culture. And my encouragement for any leader, if you are new to a role, is to listen very, very carefully for those gaps that may be occurring in terms of trust between leaders, teams, leaders, frontline employees, mid-managers. That will be an indicator of potentially some harmful downstream effects that is being caused by those trust gaps.
Well, many leaders that I've spoken to realize the importance of it, but they say, Charles, make it more actionable, right? We know that trust matters, but what does it affect? And one of the big things that it affects that you bring to light as well is a lack of engagement. And everyone talks about engagement. They want an engaged workforce, engaged employees, and they don't know how to create that level of engagement. And what you advocate for, it really starts with trust.
It does. So one of my favorite definitions of what trust is that trust is the firm belief in the truth of something. If there are 100 employees and everybody has their own version of the truth of the mission of the organization, the purpose of the organization, what should we be working on, what are our goals, what are our priorities? If you have 100 different versions of that truth, it is literally impossible to maximize the level of trust within your company. However, if there is a single version of the truth and the opportunity from an engagement standpoint is what I would call a co-creation of this new version of the truth, that's an opportunity to create authentic and meaningful and helpful engagement to where, as a leader, you may have your perception of what the truth should be, of the focus of the company. And ultimately, as a decision maker in the organization, you hold that authority. But in order to engage all of the individuals within your company or your teams, if you have meaningful and intentional opportunities to help think differently about the direction of where you're going or the opportunity to co-create a new version of that truth, that is authentic engagement. And that is engagement that also provides accountability, because if I'm engaging other team members in a new version of our truth or our direction, now we have done that together. And so there is shared ownership in that. And that is something that is a very powerful way to create authentic engagement, is thinking differently about how do we co-create our future version of our truth.
So to identify a lack of trust or this trust gap, you can look at engagement or the lack thereof. You can also listen closely to the language of distrust, which surfaces in many organizations to, we've always done it that way, or that's just the way it is. That'll never happen, or that's not my problem to solve.
Yeah, that's that exporting of responsibility and accountability. It's at its worst, it becomes more of a victim mindset. It is excusing bad behaviors that is driven by some kind of an attitude. That attitude, if it's rooted in a level of distrust, it begins to manifest and then perpetuate throughout the organization. And so that's where that whole idea of a toxic workplace, there's this kind of poison that begins to spread throughout the water. And then as that spreads, it really can have a significant effect, not only on the interpersonal dynamics, but certainly on the performance of the company itself.
Well, and there is a passage in your book that I just wanted to read briefly because I think it really speaks to what you just stated very effectively. Is that, when this mindset goes viral, it gets adopted by others and becomes a movement. As the movement grows, it gains momentum. And as momentum continues, it becomes the norm. As norms are cemented, they shape the values and the ethos of an organization. And these particles of distrust get distributed throughout the company. People breathe them in, even without knowing it, and it becomes part of the new environment and atmosphere. That says that very effectively, and hopefully everyone is listening to that, because that is so true in so many organizations when you see distrust happening or running rampant.
And it's subtle and it's not intentional, but it still has a very, very damaging effect if it's not recognized, acknowledged, and then corrected.
And you even have a great illustration of this. You talk about how the biohazard symbol was developed in 1966 by Charles Baldwin and Robert Runkle, and it was a solution to a wide range of symbols used to warn people of infectious biological agents. And they co-created this because they wanted something memorable but meaningless. Describe to me kind of what this represents and how you relate it to trust and the Venn diagram.
Yeah, that's a thank you for that question. This was actually the point in my book where I had hit a bit of a writer's wall, not quite a block yet, but I was just struggling. There was kind of a couple of different directions I could have gone, and in order to kind of clear my mind, and one of the ways that I can evoke some creativity is just by going on a run. So I went on a run, and as I was thinking about this chapter in my book on my run, I thought about the Venn diagram. And the Venn diagram, it's a universal symbol of what teamwork can look like. It's a win-win-win. People have their own individuality, but then they start collaborating with others. It creates this nexus. And then that's like this 1 + 1 = 3 and beyond, which is a great symbol. But then I was thinking about, okay, if that is representative of a unified, trustworthy team dynamic, what would be the opposite? And so for whatever reason on my run, this biohazard symbol just popped into my mind, and I ran home as quickly as I could. And I drew out the circles and I jotted it down. I did a little bit of research, and I found that this fascinating creation of the biohazard symbol, something that was intended to be meaningless, meaning not specific to one specific biohazard agent, but really it was intended to be a stop sign. So whenever you saw the biohazard, it would be a stop sign for you, or to say, if you come past this point, past this sign, you need to have protective equipment and some level of expertise. So I put up these two symbols, the Venn diagram and the biohazard symbol, next to each other. And I thought to myself, if organizations were to evaluate where they're at, they could probably plot themselves somewhere in between either the biohazard symbol or the Venn diagram. So from toxic to trustworthy. Then I looked at that biohazard symbol and I realized that what was creating the difference, the change between the Venn diagram and the biohazard symbol, were these small gaps, subtle, but still very present. And it was that gap in those systems, the gap in the continuation of those outside circles, that visually brought a break to the Venn diagram. And then more practically within a workplace culture, those are the gaps that bring a break to your system. And so that became very much the kind of guiding force for me to continue with the book and the direction that I went. And that is it's a visual representation. So the thought is, if you were to show up to work every day and you hung a sign up on the door of your workplace, would the sign be one of a Venn diagram, or would it be a toxic biohazard symbol? And as a leader, we've got to acknowledge, is this a hazardous environment that we're stepping into? Is it a well-run environment that's healthy? And then how do we maintain health, or how do we address the biohazard?
Let's talk about now the 10 problems that, if left unchecked, will only serve to widen the trust gap. We won't have time to go through all 10, but I'd like to pick out a couple of them. And is there one or two that you see quite often that's maybe the most common of these 10?
So there are. So one of the challenges of trust is that, or a lack of trust, is that it creates a tremendous amount of inefficiency in decision making. There is a rooting or an anchoring in the status quo. So status quo becomes the default, because whether there are interpersonal dynamics that are evident or interpersonal dynamics that are undefined and subtle, it locks people into, they want certainty as much as they can. And so there's kind of this protective environment of the status quo. And status quo will typically win out in an environment where there is a lower level of trust. Not that doing things in the future in the same way that you've done it in the past is always a bad thing, because sometimes it's exactly the right strategy. But if the justification for a future direction is only rooted in that status quo, and that status quo propensity is fueled by a lack of trust, that's when it can become very, very dangerous. And that is a major problem that organizations have to overcome.
Well, and these, I just want to remind our listeners, these can be applied to a personal context as well. Because the first one is, trust can be incrementally built, but can be instantly broken. I think we've all witnessed that. Once it's gone, it'll never be the same, which I think is a point worth noting. And it's always harder to rebuild it than to build it for the first time. So timeless principles, however, they need to be repeated, because I think it's definitely something that we need to be reminded of as managers and leaders, not only in a professional context, but also in a personal context.
The other one that I would say that is fairly common is, trust is rarely measured as a standalone KPI. And that key performance indicator, typically the effect of a lack of trust is measured often. But what would it look like if we thought about a balance sheet of trust in the same way that we think about a balance sheet of money? And if we elevated it to that same level, that would be a pretty powerful way of thinking about trust in terms of the priority and the foundational nature of it. But rarely do organizations think about trust as a standalone KPI. The good news is, though, It can be measured. It is something that is tangible. It is something that can be dimensionalized. And because it can be dimensionalized, there's a baseline that can be established. There can be goals and tactics set to move the needle to make it stronger. And then ultimately it can be remeasured again to see if there's progress that is being made. So we can treat it as a KPI, but that requires a different way of thinking for leaders.
The other piece of the book that really surprised me was around the value proposition, how you related that to the trust proposition, because all companies have a value proposition. Talk to me about that and that link that you have between that and what you developed as far as the trust proposition.
Yeah, great question. You know, the value proposition is such a vital part of every company in terms of the product or service that we provide to our end users. And a value proposition is something that needs to be rare. It needs to be something that is aesthetic. Do we want to be associated with it? It needs to be something that helps solve a problem or a challenge. And then the other thing is, it needs to be emotional. We have to have some kind of an emotional connection. And really what the value proposition does is it answers the question in our mind as the end user, is this product or service or offering, is it worth it? So the value proposition invites us to take action on the worth of something. But as I was thinking about the role of trust and why trust needs to occur even before the value proposition can fully be realized, I just thought about it in terms of the difference between the value proposition and then a term that I coined called the trust proposition. And so if the value proposition is about taking action on the worth of something, then the trust proposition is taking action on the truth of something. So those two elements, trust, which equals truth, value, which equals worth, those two things, when they are combined and also when they are informing each other, those are the things that will ultimately lead to better loyalty, not only internal loyalty, but also customer loyalty. And this is not theoretical. This is actually something that has been proven by research and data. The original framework that I used for my doctoral work from over 20 years ago by some marketing researchers, they determined this. It's been applied in multiple industries. I utilized it specifically in a qualitative research sense, but it's been fascinating to see now, even with my client work, and helping them delineate between, is that your value proposition or is that your trust proposition? And how do both of those work together in order to increase internal employee loyalty as well as external end user or customer loyalty?
And like you said, loyalty is the goal, value is the mediator, and
That's right.
trust is the starting point of that customer experience.
And we experience this all of the time, right? And our customer experience, even if something is a very good value to us, so it is well worth it for us to spend the time or the money. If we don't trust that company, or if they breach our trust, it doesn't matter how much of a discount or a coupon, it doesn't matter what that ultimate value proposition equation is. If we don't trust them, our loyalty will go to a substitute or to another option. And so that's the power of both of those, trust and then value, in order to shape our behaviors from a loyalty standpoint.
Let's talk now about, it's great to have goals, right? But what we need now is a system in which we can implement this, because having a system is what matters. Committing to a process is really what makes the difference. So you have the structure of trust, and it consists of 3 building blocks. You can provide an overview, and then we'll dive deeper into each one after that.
You bet. So there are lots of great frameworks around the topic of trust, and they're amazing. And I think the most important thing with a framework is that people take action on it, that you adopt it and you internalize it and you live it out. That is the key. There's not one single framework that is going to be the very best, and that's the only one that you should ever. So I just want to acknowledge that. This particular framework, it's data-driven. It's something that is, it's replicable. It's very durable. It's something that is memorable. It's only 3 primary building blocks. Those 3 primary building blocks are, number 1, competency. Competency is a big, broad word. It can mean a lot of things, but within competency, that means, of course, technical competency, financial competency, time management, project management, risk management. Leadership is a competency. It can be learned, it can be developed, it can be strengthened. So the first building block is competency. The second building block is problem solving. Now, problem solving is not just the process of problem solving, it's also the ability and the willingness of the leader to define the right problem to solve. From our research, what we find is that you may have a very good problem-solving leader, but that problem-solving leader may not necessarily always be defining the right problems to solve. So their ability to solve problems is good, but they need to be focused on the actual problem that is concerning the rest of the organization. So that's been a key learning from our research and our work with clients. So competency, and then problem solving. And then the third building block, which is often the most difficult for organizations and teams, is the building block of care for others. And this is the human side of the work that we do from a leadership and a management standpoint. So those three things, competency, problem solving, and care for others, without care for others, things like empathy, sympathy, active listening, caring for the needs of the whole person, you may have a very competent and efficient leader or team, but if they do not demonstrate care for others, they're not maximizing trust. If they're not maximizing trust, it will affect the value proposition. When the value proposition is affected, it deeply affects loyalty. So if you think about it in terms of like a three-legged stool, you have to have all three: competency and problem solving and care for others. Otherwise, the dynamic will feel wobbly, it will feel wonky. People will not be able to necessarily articulate what's wrong, but they will know that it will feel unstable. The important part about the model as well is this: those three building blocks are not only applicable to the people of our organization, but they're also applicable to the policies and the practices of our organization. So we have to have trustworthy people who demonstrate competency and problem solving and care for others. But we also have to have trustworthy policies and practices and programs. Policies, practices, and programs that are competent, that are problem solving, and that ultimately demonstrate care for others. It's those two realms, people and policy and practices, when infused with these three building blocks, competency, problem solving, and care for others, that the data shows over and over and over will result in a high level of trust within the organization. So although it's not prescriptive or completely formulaic, it is a framework that is proven, and it's simple enough to where it can be adopted by any person within the organization. They just have to prioritize that as a framework moving forward. So that shared definition of trust, that shared framework of trust, is really, really helpful for leaders and teams to think differently about their workplace culture and how the foundational element of that is trust.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Cory Scheer. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
You bet. I'm active on LinkedIn, so they can look up my name on LinkedIn, Cory Scheer, CoryScheer, or the website for my company is called TrustCentric Consulting, which is trustcentricconsulting.com. And would love to connect via LinkedIn or through the website. And thank you again so much for the opportunity to share about this work. And I truly hope that it's been helpful.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.